Okay, so here's our verse, right? 129. Vepatus chastarire me, Roma harshas jayate, Gandivan samsate hastat, Tvakchaiva paridahyate, Vepatush chastarire me, Roma harshas jayate, Gandivam samsate hastat, Tvakchaiva paridahyate. So that's the Sanskrit. Um, and, the translation, and of course, this is the word for word, Vepatu, trembling of the body, cha, also sharire, on the body, may, my, romaharsha, standing of the hair on end, cha, also jayate, is taking place. Gandivam, the bow of Arjuna, shram, shate, is slipping. Hashtat, from the hand. Tvak, skin. Cha, also. Eva, certainly. Paridahyate, is burning. My whole body is trembling. My hair is standing on end. My bow, Gandiva, is slipping from my hand. My skin is burning. This is Arjuna's report to Krishna. Can all of you actually see this? Is, one thing we've discovered is that if you're using a phone, if you hold it horizontally as opposed to vertically, you can see these words a little bit better. So this gives you a chance to read what the Bhagavad-gita is actually saying as I'm reading it out too, in case you don't have a Bhagavad-gita handy, you're not looking at chapter 1, text 30. There are two kinds of trembling of the body and two kinds of standing of hair on the end. Such phenomena occur either in great spiritual ecstasy or out of great fear under material conditions. There is no fear in transcendental realization. Arjuna's symptoms in this situation are out of material fear, namely loss of life. This is evident from other symptoms also. He became so impatient that his famous bow Gandiva was slipping from his hands. And because his heart was burning within him, he was feeling a burning sensation of the skin. All these are due to a material conception of life. All right, so this particular section here, this is the first chapter of Bhagavad-gita. Bhagavad-gita has 18 chapters. And the first chapter describes mostly the idea of, it kind of brings us out of the larger scope of the Mahabharata. So the Mahabharata is, of course, an epic which has 200,000 verses. The Bhagavad Gita only has basically 700 verses. So the Bhagavad Gita, it's translated as the Song of God, and it's the 30 minutes or so, or maybe it was an hour or so, that it took Krishna to explain to Arjuna why he should engage in the battle of Kurukshetra. He had opted out of the battle. He felt that the battle was unrighteous, and we'll talk about that, some of the reasons that Arjuna felt that way today. And this idea of him engaging in the battle of Kurukshetra was the key element, because the entire Mahabharata at that point is leading up to this encounter between the Kuru dynasty, which is Dhritarashtra's sons, Duryodhan and their brothers, their 99 brothers of Duryodhan, and the Pandavas, who there were only 5 of. And the Pandavas have the smaller army. They have something like 7 Akshohinis of soldiers, and the Kurus have 11 Akshohinis. So, they are bigger in number. And of course, the Kurus also have on their side many important warriors that were considered to be the best warriors on the planet at that time. So many things led up to this battle, and I'm going to discuss a particular section of this at detail today. But what I really want to discuss at this point is just an overview that this is the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. And being the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, it basically, uh, you know, describes the process of looking at the armies, blowing the conch shells, and then Arjuna's meltdown, which we see here. So the Bhagavad Gita, as we all know, is the ABCs of spiritual life. This is the way that Prabhupada described it. And it explains it's not just a battle story about Arjuna and his, uh, his sort of metaphysical consternation just before the battle started. It's not really about that. It's about all of our situations in the material world, why we're here, what's going on here, and what we could do about it. So the Bhagavad Gita describes our existential position in this strange world, describes how to get out of the entanglement of this world for good. Um, and here was our verse again. Up at the top, we see the actual Sanskrit Devanagari, and then we have that moving into the transliteration, where the Sanskrit Devanagari is transliterated into Roman letters. And then after that, we see at the bottom the translation there. My whole body is trembling, my hair is standing on end, my bow Gandiva is slipping from my hand, my skin is burning. For those of you who have been at this, particular class that Atma gives every Saturday, you've been following these verses verse by verse. We're at verse 28, or is it 29? I think 29 of chapter 1. So what has led up before was, in verses 1 through 27, we had the war preparations where basically uh, Dhritarashtra, who is the oldest, but he can't fight because he's blind. So Dhritarashtra was supposed to be the king of the world at that time, but he was not allowed to be the king because he was born blind. But his son wanted to be the king. Now, actually, the Pandavas should have been the people who took over the rulership, but they were not at the right place at the right time. So they had grown up in the forest where their father, who was the previous king, was ruling. Their father was named Pandu, and Pandu was a brother to Dhritarashtra. There were three brothers. There was Dhritarashtra, the eldest, Pandu, the second in line, and Vidura. And these three, Dhritarashtra was passed over because he was blind, but Pandu was the actual reigning king. But Pandu passed away early in his life, and out of the children of Dhritarashtra and Pandu, the oldest ones were the Pandavas, so they should have been the next in line, but they were not allowed to be the next in line because of the political trickery of Duryodhan's eldest son, whose name was, Dhritarashtra's eldest son, whose name was Duryodhan. So from verse 1 through 27, we hear about Duryodhan's musings on the army. We hear about the conch shells being blown. And then Krishna wheels the chariots, the chariot that he and Arjuna are sitting on, between the two armies. And when Arjuna sees the other side, he begins to have doubts. So that started one verse ago in 28, and we're now on 29, and that will continue through to the end of this chapter. So the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita is this pulling ourselves out of the storyline of Mahabharata. And we're hearing about what led up to the Battle of Kurukshetra. And in Bhagavad Gita, we're kind of taking a time out from the Battle of Kurukshetra because there's no fighting that's going on in Bhagavad Gita. All the fighting happens after Bhagavad Gita is finished. But the Bhagavad Gita actually describes Arjuna's moral difficulty with the Battle of Kurukshetra, because in most types of warfare, the people on the other side of the battlefield are people who are strangers for the most part. But this was not the case in the Battle of Kurukshetra. Everyone here is family. So everybody on both sides knows each other very well. They're not at all strangers to one another. And Arjuna is having second thoughts about fighting this battle, and we'll talk about exactly why. And that's the nature of this particular section that we're describing. And Arjuna's doubts start off, as we've just heard, with this notion that Arjuna is feeling physical symptoms. And they are, his feeling of his skin burning. He feels that his bow is sliding from his hand. He feels that his consciousness is having, is not in equilibrium. All these things are the nature of the experiences that Arjuna is uh, undergoing right at that point. His body is trembling, his hair is standing on end, his bow is slipping from his hand, and his skin is burning. So this is the physical symptoms. And Prabhupada's describing that these physical symptoms are uh, done because he is in material anguish. So Prabhupada has described it. We can feel these symptoms like, hair standing on end and tears and a certain sense of uh, uncontrollable internal emotion under two circumstances. One is in great spiritual ecstasy and one is in great material fear. Of course, although the symptoms appear similar in both of these instances, these are two very different phenomena. That material fear is a very strong identification with the body, whereas the idea of spiritual ecstasy is exactly the opposite of a complete detachment from the body. And that is the nature of spiritual life. Spiritual life is supposed to, if it's done properly, gradually help us to recognize that the material body is not who we really are. So that's the nature of spiritual life. It's supposed to be a physical process, a process of mental and physical activity that cultivates or cultures a understanding that we do not belong to this world, we never did, and that there's another world, that's the spiritual world, and that we can go there and we can leave this world behind because this world will never satisfy us, and this world is also a world that is full of problems of various kinds that can we can overcome individual problems, but the problems of this world will always be there in some form or another because the material world is designed not to really give us any peace. It's designed not to give any of us any real rest. And this is done on purpose. It's a design, and the spiritual world is where we really belong, where everyone is focused on the Supreme Lord. But to go there, we have to actually want to focus on the Supreme Lord, which most of us don't. And that's why we stay here in this world. All right, so I'm going to try to take this in short bursts here. So let me ask if anyone has any questions or comments so far in what we've just discussed in the beginning of the Bhagavad-gita, the Mahabharata, the events leading up to where we are right now in the Bhagavad-gita and also in the greater Mahabharata. Anybody have any questions about any of that?
Hare Krishna Maharaj.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah, it was just in the purport. I think I learned once before, but I've forgotten when Srila Prabhupada's use of the word impatient. What does he mean by that word?
Okay, let me back up to that here. Um, uh, I think Prabhupada's using that word in a very unusual sense there. Let me pull it up on the screen here so that we can look at it here. No, that's not what I want. I want this. There are two kinds of trembling of the body. Here we read that, and you're talking about the second sentence, the second part of the first paragraph. He became so impatient that his famous bow was slipping from his hands, and because his heart was burning within him, he was feeling a burning sensation of his skin. Um, Impatient, I think, uh, basically in this case, what Prabhupada means by impatient is that Arjuna was feeling not in equilibrium, not patient or in equilibrium, not in the sense of what we usually think by the word impatient, which implies the idea that somebody is expecting something and wishing it would hurry up, you know. Certainly, Arjuna is not wishing the Battle of Kurukshetra would hurry up. In fact, he's thinking about ducking out of it. So I think basically impatient there is a synonym for in disequilibrium, but that's just how I would muse about it.
Okay, Maharaj, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions about any of this or the basic idea of what the Bhagavad-gita represents? All right, I'll let everybody think a little bit. You can always, if you want, get a piece of paper out of some kind of scratch paper and scribble something down as I'm talking. And if you, I will pause like this every so often throughout this presentation. And if someone does have something that they wish to, look deeper into, we can talk about it. So keep your little pencil and paper out, and if you think of something, jot it down, and then you can. Because generally speaking, since the topics kind of range, if you just try to remember it, it'll just kind of pass out of your memory for the more or less. So don't rely on your memory. Okay, so we talked about this verse a bit, and we talked about how the first to 27th verse of this chapter, chapter 1, was the war preparations, and the 28th to 46th verse of this chapter, excuse me, is Arjuna's doubts. Now, this is a sequence in the flow of how things are happening. First, Sanjaya and Dhritarashtra are talking. That's kind of like if this was a movie, what you'd first see is not the battlefield, but you would see a king in his inner throne room who was blind, sitting on a great chair or throne of some sort. And he was speaking to his secretary, Sanjaya, and asking Sanjaya to relate to him what's going on in the battle. Of course, one of the interesting things here is that Sanjaya is able to perceive what's going on the battlefield, even though he's with the king in the royal, inner chambers in the palace. This was because the great sage Vyasadeva uh, was going to give Dhritarashtra not only regular vision, he's blind, he was offered, Vyasadeva offered to restore his regular vision. And not only that, he would have been able to internally see what was going on the battlefield as it was happening. But you can imagine, as a person who had been blind from death turned down both of these because he could understand theoretically that his sons were going to get wiped out, and he didn't want to actually witness it visually. It was going to be hard enough for him to take. So he was passed over, but instead Vyasadeva gave the same boon to Sanjaya. Sanjaya was not blind, but he got the mystic vision to be able to perceive the battle. And not only that, but to actually understand mentally what kind of thinking the various participants in the battle would be having. So he's kind of as like a television announcer doing a play by play for what's going on in the battle to the king Dhritarashtra, who's blind sitting on his throne. But we only see that for a verse or two. Then we immediately move on. The camera zooms out of Dhritarashtra and Sanjaya to Duryodhana, and Duryodhana's talking with his generals and his staff, and they are assessing who's on the Pandava side, So Duryodhana is saying, this Pandava is very important, that Pandava is very important, but then he assesses his own warriors and says, but our warriors are better, so we don't have anything to worry about. And then after that, the conchas are blown. You all just read all this stuff. The conchas are blown first on Duryodhana's side, and then the conchas are blown on the Pandava side. And when the conchas are blown on the Pandava side, the hearts of the Kurus are shattered. So then Arjuna asks Krishna to put the chariot between both armies so he can get a look at the people that he's going to fight in the next few minutes. He wants to see the opposing army. Of course, he knows who's in the opposing army, but he wants to see them. And then as soon as that happens, Krishna presages that, in a humorous way, that, oh, behold, the army of the Kurus, my dear Arjuna, knowing that this is going to quake Arjuna in his boots. And it does. It upsets Arjuna, and then he begins to describe the symptoms that we just read about his skin burning, his bow slipping from his hands, him feeling all these various physical symptoms. Because he's not so much worried about himself dying, he's worried about what's going to happen as a result of this battle. And this is my next little segment here, and I'll go through that, and then we can pause again for questions. So Arjuna had 5 reasons for not fighting. And I use a little, acronym to remember them. CEDFI. If you look at the first letter of each of these 5 things, CEDFI, CEDFI. I don't know why. Somehow or another, I can remember that. It's kind of a, it's not a word that means anything, but it helps me to remember these. So number 1 is compassion. He feels like, why are we fighting the Kurus? Because fighting them is not a compassionate thing to do. His second reasoning is enjoyment. He's saying that we shouldn't fight the Pandavas because if we kill our own family members, how can we enjoy after that? We will feel a sense of emptiness. And the third is destruction of family. So family gets destroyed, then what will happen to the women? Arjuna will make the statement that if all the men are killed, then the women will all be widows, and the chance of them, being morally corrupted then is quite high because they're all have lost their husbands. And the fourth one is a fear of sinful reaction. Arjuna feels that the act of killing all these soldiers, the sin involved in that must be enormous. So why are we doing it? And then finally, his last reasoning for deciding to desist from the battle will be indecision, that he feels it's not clear that this battle is a righteous battle. It's not clear who's going to win. And he's not certain that any real purpose will be served in engaging in this battle. So compassion, enjoyment, destruction of family, fear of sinful reactions, and indecision. These are the different things that Arjuna is worried about. And you'll see in brackets there right next to it which verses these different subjects or these different themes are described in. Compassion is in the 27th verse, in the 37th, and the 38th, the 44th, the 45th, and in the following chapter, in chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. This bleeds over into chapter 2, but it only bleeds over into about the first 10 verses of chapter 2. So then chapter 2 goes on to a different thing altogether. But Arjuna's reasons and his emotional state is summed up in this second half of chapter 1 and bleeds over into the first, 5% of chapter 2. So enjoyment, he talks about that theme for his deciding not to fight in verse 31 to 35 and in verse 44. Destruction of family is in verses 36 to 44, where he describes what he feels is the deleterious effects of so many women becoming widows as a result of this battle. And then in for fear of sinful reaction, he talks about that in the 36th verse, and in the second chapter, verses 4 and 5. And indecision is described in the 6th verse of the second chapter. All right, so these are Arjuna's reasons for not fighting. Again, so I'm going to pause. Any questions or comments about any of that?
Unmute. Hare Krishna Maharaj?
Oh, Hare Krishna.
Yeah, just a question about the slide that you just had up there.
Mm-hmm.
It looked like, okay, I was trying to copy this down. Destruction of the family was discussed in verses 36 to 44.
Yeah.
And then I think I copied something down wrong. Because
you can always take a picture of it with your cell phone or something like that. I'll hope to put these back up on YouTube as soon as I can, but I've really had a lot of trouble with the audio lately.
136 to 4 and 5. Okay. So therefore, looks like there's an overlap, right? Where destruction of the family is discussed in the 36th verse, but is also discussed in when it comes to fear of sinful reaction.
Right.
Verse 36. So verse 36 seems like it covers both of those things, right?
It does. So some of these themes are more than one theme is discussed in a single verse. That's right. There's no overlap. Even these topics themselves, conceptually, there's an overlap between them. So, it's something could be, the fear of sinful reaction, compassion. In some ways, there's a similarity there. Destruction of family and fear of sinful reaction. There's a similarity there too. Just in conceptual terms, there's a little bit of bleed over, but I think that's kind of the way everything always works. So.
Yeah, like compassion and enjoyment. There is some overlap there too, right?
Yeah. By compassion here, Arjuna feels that, as he's stating, that he feels that the Pandavas actually understand spiritual life. Obviously, the Kurus don't. And so why should they push themselves on the Kurus knowing that they're going to react badly in the situation? And in this way, why do they really need a kingdom? Arjuna is really unthinking the entire motivation that led them into the Battle of Kurukshetra, which is interesting. And I'm going to discuss here in a few minutes. I think we'll get to that. The whole preceding, chapter just before the Bhagavad-gita is spoken and before the Battle of Kurukshetra takes place. It's called the Udyoga Parva of the Mahabharata. So in the Udyoga Parva, that whole parva or chapter is describing what happened after the Pandavas had completed their exile for 13 years and their 1 year in incognito and not having been discovered. So the uh, Mahabharata in that chapter, the Udyoga Parva, discusses how after completing their terms of the gambling match, now they're expecting to get their kingdom back, but they're not sure what Duryodhana has actually got planned. So we're going to be talking about that, what it is that Duryodhana decides, and the idea that they are putting back and forth the proposition of should we fight, should we not fight, why should we fight, why should we not fight, and then we come back to this idea of why Arjuna decides, well, maybe this is a bad idea. And in this Udyoga Parva, we don't see any vacillation at all on the Kuru side. Duryodhana is firmly convinced he wants the kingdom. He doesn't want anything to do with the Pandavas. Duryodhana is firmly convinced that the Pandavas, if they want to try to get the kingdom back, he's going to fight them and he's going to win. He's totally convinced of that. His mental view on the whole situation never vacillates even one iota until, of course, the battle actually starts. But up until the time the battle actually starts, he has got the same mentality. He's going to fight. He doesn't care. But the Pandavas, on the other hand, are tossing this around. Is this really the right thing to do? Yudhisthira has his doubts, but Krishna quickly quashes them. And we see that even Bhimsen, who was kind of, you wouldn't ever think of it, thinking that maybe there's another way, But ultimately, after a number of interchanges take place, it becomes clear. It becomes clear to everyone.
Marge, if you can hear us, we just your connection just stopped.
Duryodhana is a fool, and that there's no other possibility other than the battle, and so that's what will happen. So let me go on here a little bit. We've talked about here, this is the kind of flow of chapter 1. Now, okay. So here is a rundown of the Udyoga Parva of the Mahabharata. And I thought I would kind of describe it to everybody. Because sometimes I think, especially in our modern world, people think, why did Krishna talk Arjuna out of a pacifistic, a unifying consciousness into a warlike consciousness where he engages in a battle, an incredible battle that wastes the lives of hundreds of millions of people. So this is certainly an interesting subject. Some years ago, this would have been even more controversial than it is now. Of course, it's even controversial now. But I think it's important to kind of look at this whole idea. Is Krishna some kind of warmonger? Is this some kind of jihad or something like that? So let's take a look at it, because as we said, and as some of you know, maybe some of you don't, the Mahabharata records that the Pandavas were, they grew up outside of the palace. They were the sons of Pandu, but Pandu wasn't a stay-at-home king. Pandu liked to be out in the community. He liked to be out in the forest. Why did he like to be out in the forest? Because the sages were out there. And he liked to spend time with the sages and hear from them philosophical knowledge. Pandu was cursed because of a mistake he made. And he would die when he would try to approach any of his wives to beget children by them. He knew that, they knew that, and so he purposefully tried to play it cool and stay away from his wives. He had two, Kunti and Madri. And he more or less succeeded up to a certain point, and then one day he was just overwhelmed. And when he tried to approach his wife to engage with her, he died. And at that time, the Pandavas were adolescents, they were not matured, but they had grown up with their father outside of the palace. Now, Duryodhan and his 99 brothers did not grow up outside of the palace. They were always in the palace with their father, who was Dhritarashtra. And so they were basically running things. And all of them knew, particularly Duryodhan, that the Pandavas really had the right to the throne. But that bothered Duryodhan intensely because he wanted to rule. So he did whatever he could to set it up so that he would be the king and that the Pandavas wouldn't have any place to have any foothold in the kingdom. So at some point, when shortly after Pandu left his body, the Pandavas were reinstated they came out of the forest and came back into the kingdom. And there were strangers there in the palace. And Duryodhan began to figure out ways to maybe kill them and get rid of them in some ways or another. He made a poison cake, tried to burn them in a house. He tried to do all these various things to try to get rid of them. At a certain point, the Pandavas, when they grew older, approached the older king, the one who was blind, and said, at least let us have some piece of land that we can rule. So very graciously, Dhritarashtra gave them a piece of useless desert land that was not wanted by anyone. But the Pandavas, they administered that land, and with the help of Krishna, they turned it into a wonderful, productive region that began to rival Hastinapur, which made Duryodhan burn with envy. And so Duryodhan tried to figure out how he could get this away from them. So he proposed a gambling match where he had dice that had been rigged so that he when he played his dice, then he would always win. He worked this out with his uncle Shakuni. So the Pandavas were challenged to a gambling match, and Yudhisthira, the eldest Pandu, agreed to the gambling match. And in that gambling match, they essentially gambled away their entire kingdom. And then at the end of when they had nothing left, Duryodhan suggested that they gambled themselves away. And so they gambled themselves away, and they theoretically, through the gambling match, became slaves of the Kurus. And then after they had gambled themselves away, he said, well, do you have anything else left? And they said, oh, you have one thing left. You have your wife, Draupadi. So he suggested they gamble her away. And of course, again, she was lost, and she was dragged out by the brothers, the Kuru brothers, who said that now she was their slave and so on and so forth. They tried to humiliate her at one point. Dushasana tried to take her clothes off. And this was a great insult. And Draupadi appealed to the assembly, and Duryodhan's father, Dhritarashtra, had a moment of sobriety, and he said, no, this has gone too far. I give you, my dear Draupadi, anything that you want, any benediction that you want. She said, well, let my husbands have their kingdom back and let them go free. And so at that point, Dhritarashtra allowed that. And so he reversed it. You can imagine the consternation of his son at that point, who had just felt like he was on the top of the world. He'd just done in his main rivals in this ridiculous gambling match, and now his father had turned it around. And so there was a second gambling match, and in this gambling match, the stakes were different. The stakes were that if they won, uh, they could rule the kingdom. If they lost, they would have to go into exile for 13 years. And for 1 year, they would have to be incognito. If they were discovered in that one incognito year at the end of the 13 years in exile, they would have to go for another 13 years in exile. So that was the nature of the contract. And of course, they lost again. So they had to go into exile, which they did. They and their common wife, Draupadi, went into exile for a full 13 years. And then for the 14th year, they were incognito and they were not discovered. So when they came out, they expected, okay, we've lived the terms of this ridiculous gambling match. Now we expect our kingdom back. But they thought, well, what does Duryodhana actually intend at this point? So right after the marriage of Abhimanyu and Uttara, uh, they were all together in Upaplavya, and there in Upaplavya, they were kind of comfortably situated and relaxed. And Krishna opened the idea with describing that, well, what should we do now? That I think that we should actually approach Duryodhana to find out what he says at this point. We know that Yudhisthira had a kingdom. We know that his kingdom was taken away, but was given back, and that the terms of this exile are now over because the Pandavas have lived out the terms of this exile. And he says, I think we should send an emissary to Hastinapur. They were in Upaplavya, and the seat of government was Hastinapur. So he said, I think we should send an envoy to Hastinapur. And um, Balaram spoke up, who was Krishna's brother. Balaram says, I fully agree with what my brother has said. I think that a brahmana or some envoy should be sent, and he should humbly ask Dhritarashtra and Duryodhana and the Kurus what they intend to do, that we have fulfilled our terms of the contract, so what should happen next? And before he could finish, Satyaki broke in and said, Balaram, you are speaking complete nonsense. He said, why should we whimper up to Duryodhana and to Dhritarashtra? Everyone knows what the terms of the contract are, and they are the rightful rulers not only of Upaplavya and not only of their Indraprastha, their region that they had gambled away from them. That they're actually the rulers of everything. So I suggest we don't send an envoy. I suggest we send arrows to Hastinapur. And King Draupad, who was their ally, said, yes, I agree with what Satyaki says, that if we come to Duryodhana and Dhritarashtra in a humble mood, they will interpret that as weakness, and they will not respond favorably at all. I think that we should go there and that we should just say that we are going to take our kingdom back. Do you all want to fight about it? And that's what we should send. And Krishna drew back the situation again and said, yes, I think basically that's correct, that we should ask a trusted brahmana that Drupad knows to be our envoy, and he will go and he will try to broker some peace and see what's there. We will try to see if we can come up with a peaceful solution to this difficulty now that we face, because we expect our kingdom back, and we also think that it's likely Duryodhana will not want to relinquish anything. So they did. They sent a brahmana to Hastinapur. And when the Brahmana appeared in Hastinapur, he was warmly received, and then he began to make his explanation of the Pandavas' intentions before the court at Hastinapur. And as he was speaking, he described the the mood of Arjuna. And he, said that actually Arjuna has stated that they expect their kingdom back, and that he has no qualms about if the kingdom is not returned, that there will certainly be a war. We wish there was no war, but we expect that Yudhisthira will be reinstated in his kingdom. And when he said that, Dhritarashtra said, "Yes, I think this is right. We should try to give some kind of land to the Pandavas." And Duryodhana replied, as you might expect, that he felt there's no need to worry about the Pandavas. And Karna spoke up and said, actually, why do we have to worry about the Pandavas? You don't even need anybody else. I can hold the Pandavas at bay just myself. And Bhishmadev said, "You are a fool, Karna. Don't you remember that you and all the other Kurus were just defeated by Arjuna himself?" Which was an episode that happened while they were incognito for that final year. And during that year, someone had tried, the Kurus had tried to steal cows from the kingdom of Virat, and Arjuna had held them off. Single-handedly, Arjuna. It wasn't even all the Pandavas, it was just him. So Bhishma was bringing that up. And of course, Karna felt humiliated, and he left the assembly. And of course, Duryodhana couldn't listen. And then they send Sanjaya back to Upaplavya. So they decide that Sanjaya will be their emissary from the court of Hastinapur to Upaplavya. So they tell Sanjaya, "My dear Sanjaya, you go back to the court at Upaplavya and tell the Pandavas that why should they want to warmonger? That we should try to find some kind of peaceful settlement." This is what Dhritarashtra was proposing. So they send Sanjaya back, and Sanjaya says, "My dear Pandavas, you are all known for your righteousness, for your upstanding upholding of all religious principles. Why should you want to fight for this kingdom now? Rather, you should just accept your situation. And peace will be the righteous thing. After all, we should not desire after anything material in this material world." And to that, Krishna objected. You'll see that I pause sometimes because my screen is telling me my computer connection is unstable. So I think then that must mean I'm freezing up on your side. So if I just stop momentarily, you'll know that's what's going on. So Krishna said, "I have no objection to peace, but Yudhisthira is a king, and he deserves some kind of kingdom. And I am not willing to broker a peace at any cost. I'm willing to broker a peace that understands the actual principles of what's at stake here." So he says, "My dear Sanjaya, I think you do not actually know what the principles of religion are. That Yudhisthira is really following the principles of religion, and that what's at stake here is that the Pandavas must rule something." And Yudhisthira had even volunteered that they would be happy with just 5 small, insignificant villages. They didn't even have to be major rulers in the kingdom. But because they were Kshatriyas, they couldn't engage in any other occupation. They would be ill suited to be farmers or laborers or brahmanas. That wasn't their role in society. So instead, they needed to rule something. So even if it couldn't be a major thing, they were willing to rule some insignificant thing. And when Sanjaya returned to Hastinapur, he related to Dhritarashtra and the Kurus there in Hastinapur what had been said. And he said that, my personal opinion is that if Duryodhana doesn't want to cede anything to the Pandavas, he is going to ruin himself. And all the kings that are allied with him now, they are all just few inches away from graves, that they will have to follow him as he will be wiped out by the Pandavas. By this time, both sides had already started to canvass for military support. They had gone to various kings, knowing that whoever reached a king first, the king would have voluntarily accepted to fight on their side. And both the Kurus and the Pandavas were doing this. So it was already kind of a move towards how do we exactly set up this battle. But nevertheless, when Sanjaya spoke like this, Dhritarashtra began to lament. And he said, my son never listens to anybody, and he is born to destroy our whole race. And of course, Duryodhana didn't pay any attention to this. And Sanjaya said, my dear Dhritarashtra, your lamentation is absolutely useless because you let him do whatever he wants to do. So it's actually on you. You're the one that's creating this problem. And Dhritarashtra and Vidura begin to speak throughout the whole night, and they talk about various kinds of spiritual life. And he says, my dear Dhritarashtra, I always tell you all kinds of spiritual teachings for your benefit, and you listen to them, but you never act on them. You always do the wrong thing at the end. You always allow your wicked son to do whatever he wants to do. And this is your undoing. You will have to endure the result that comes from this. And then he says to Sanjaya, Dhritarashtra asked Sanjaya, please tell me who is actually in your um, estimation going to win this battle. And actually, but he asked Vidura that. He asked Vidura, who will actually win this battle? And Vidura replies that, my dear King Dhritarashtra, if I tell you this uh, between the two of us, you will take it personally. So I have to say this. If you will call Vyasadeva and you will call your wife and others, if I explain to you who will win in their company, then they will back up what I say, and you will not take it as a personal affront. So um, Dhritarashtra calls all of them. His wife, he calls his wife, he calls Vyasadeva, who is the writer of the Vedas, and all of them come, and he explains that certainly Krishna is on the other side. And no matter what you say, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of God. And if you go against him, you can never win. Even if he claims he's not going to fight, which he had already determined that he would be on Arjuna's side, but he personally would not take part in the combat. He would simply be the chariot driver of Arjuna. And so Dhritarashtra says, well, my dear Vidura, how is it that you have so much faith in this Krishna and I don't have any? And Vidura tells Dhritarashtra, it's because you are not actually engaged in the spiritual practice. And because you have a sinful past, you are surrounded by bad company, your son and others, and therefore you cannot have any firm faith. But if you actually would engage in spiritual life, and you engage in spiritual activities of various kinds in here, then that would go away. So uh, throughout the night, they go on, and the next day, uh, Sanjaya explains more to the court at Hastinapur about what Arjuna had said, what Yudhishthira had said, and he doesn't get anywhere. Duryodhana is unmoved. Duryodhana makes the famous statement that I would not give the Pandavas even enough land to drive the head of a pin. And Dhritarashtra says, well, my son, I reject you. I think you're a fool, and you are going to cause the destruction of our entire dynasty. And his mother, Gandhari, says, you never listen to any superior advice, and therefore you will have to suffer as a result of this. So both of his parents are trying to dissuade Duryodhana from his hell-bent path. And then Vyasadeva tries to describe the real situation to Duryodhana, again failing. Bhishmadev calls Duryodhana a fool directly and explains that he is born for the destruction of the entire Kshatriya race. So all these people have made their attempt. Meanwhile, in Upaplavya, Krishna says, my dear Pandavas, we haven't heard much back, but I think that I should myself go to Hastinapur. I will make one last attempt at trying to broker some kind of negotiated peace between the Pandavas, you all, and the Kauravas. And let me give that one last try. I think that I will fail, but I would not be complete if I did not make this attempt. People might later claim that I am some kind of warmonger. So this is what Krishna decided to do. And of course, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Couldn't he stop the Battle of Kurukshetra? This is the kind of thing that many times people think. And he could if he stepped on everybody's free will. But he's never going to do that. And that's the whole nature of the material world, that he is all powerful, but he's never going to interfere with somebody's free will, not even Duryodhana's free will or anybody else's free will. So he lets people do what they're determined to do, even if it's the wrong thing. So Krishna does, in fact, saddle up and go to Hastinapur. And there he makes one more attempt to plead before the court at Hastinapur, before Duryodhana, Bhishmadev, and all the others that are assembled there who are part of the Kuru army, that there should be some kind of grant of some type of kingdomship to the Pandavas, even if it's not very great. At that point, Duryodhana's hubris just bubbles over, and he decides he's going to try to capture Krishna. So he stations some of his men around the various points in the palace, and he signals them to attack Krishna, to hold him captive. They feel that if they've got Krishna as a captive, they can use Krishna for ransom, and it'll be a good PowerPoint to be used and later in the later part of the negotiations or in the battle. And as they start to advance toward Krishna, Krishna says, you imagine that I've come here by myself, but I have not. And then Krishna reveals partly his universal form, and this form has all the demigods coming out of him, all these various energies come out of him. Duryodhana is dumbstruck. He can't even move, you know. And Krishna then, after withdrawing his universal form, he leaves, and he says that I think at this point it's clear that the future is war. And he goes back and informs the Pandavas of that. And Duryodhana has not budged an inch from his original position, which is that the Pandavas have nothing to do with his kingdom as far as he's concerned. And so therefore now as we say, the die is cast and everybody's ready for the Battle of Kurukshetra. So this was kind of the Mahabharata side of the Bhagavad Gita, and why, you know, at this point, war was the only option, that Yudhisthira and the Pandavas were willing to barter away even an enormous amount of influence down to just 5 villages if Duryodhana would accept that they would have at least that much to govern. But Duryodhana was so arrogant and so egomaniacal that he was unable to even go that much. And so this is why the Battle of Kurukshetra wound up being fought. And it exhausted the lives of most of the soldiers, most of the Kshatriyas on the earth at that time. So let me ask again if there are any other people who have any questions or comments about that part of the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata.
So anyone who's not been here before, please don't be shy. This is your last chance to ask questions for the class. So please go ahead. Anyone, if you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or perhaps you can type it in if you don't want to speak or you can't unmute yourself for some reason. Marge, I think Miguel has a question.
Okay.
He was patient. He waited till now. So
Okay, I'm open.
go ahead, Miguel. You can speak.
Oh, thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Miguel, one thing, please.
Yeah.
I love it when you ask questions. So remember, one thing that we like about how you do it is you keep it brief. Your question, okay?
Okay. Yes.
Great.
Very short and deepening quickly. I actually like and love the story books in the Bhagavad-gita, but one question that I do want to ask is how can you actually overcome fear with the discussion here from the stories that you've been teaching us throughout these lessons today?
Do you mean overcome personal fear?
Yes, definitely personal fear.
Yeah, good. It's a good question. And this is a question that has a simple answer, but it's hard to grasp that answer until you've actually had some personal experience. The process of hearing about spiritual life theoretically informs us that we are not our bodies, that the soul is eternal. It's encased in a body at this present moment, and that body has been selected for us by the process of karma. We've gotten a particular body because of our past desires and also for our past activities, are some of which were good activities or good karma, some of which were bad. And as a result, we've gotten a particular body in a particular place, in a particular country, in a particular setting, and a particular family. So this is how we've wound up with the body that we have. Now, this body is not going to last forever. It's at some point going to get destroyed or just, disintegrate as a result of old age. In some way or another, this body will wind up getting lost. And we hear about this. And of course, this is not a new idea or a exclusive idea. A lot of people talk about the idea of the soul being immortal. But we hear about this theoretically. But when we actually engage in spiritual life, we begin to experience this. It's not just a feeling, it's an experience. And we call that vigyan. So gyan is understanding something theoretically, and vigyan is understanding something through personal internal experience. That's what vigyan is. And by day-to-day activities, which we call the activities of sadhana bhakti, and by hearing and chanting about the Supreme Lord, and hearing, the pastimes and also the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, we become more and more convinced that this is not just some, interesting ancient, mythology, but this is actually the way the world really is. And as you become more and more convinced of that, and as you become deeper into the practice of spiritual life, you become detached from your body, where whether the body is um, going to soon perish or not is not a big deal, because you know the body will perish at one time or another, and that the soul will not perish when the body does. So, this is what gives us fearlessness. So we've been talking about this actually in the Srimad Bhagavatam classes lately, and this theme has come up in the 14th chapter of the first canto, and also in the 18th or 19th chapter, I think, of the first canto. The same issue is there, that through the process of Krishna consciousness, one becomes fearless, one becomes free from sin, one becomes relieved from various kinds of anxiety or suffering. All these things happen simultaneously through the process of Krishna consciousness. This is in part because our karma lightens up. This is in part because our sinful reactions are abated. This is in part because we're gaining knowledge. And this is in part because we are getting realization, and we are feeling that this body is an external thing to our consciousness. We are not the body. We are in the body. That's all. So that's how I would answer that. It's a question. It's an answer that sort of deals with the subject, but until you actually experience the process of Krishna consciousness firsthand by doing it for some period of time, then you will actually understand that this is not just some kind of nice high sounding words that are really not talking about any reality. This is real. So anyway, that's how I respond to your question.
Maharaj, I don't know if you see it, but Susan has a question, but she put it forth through the chat.
On the
If
chat.
you like, I
Okay,
could read it out myself. I could read it out,
No,
or
I can
not.
go to the chat. Okay.
Okay.
Is there any kind of stigma to go against what is apparently a bad family in general? A simple reaction. Is it about a great respect for family culturally ingrained that must be upheld? What is restraining Arjuna? Well, Arjuna definitely understands that I'll answer what I think is the question, and you can tell me whether I actually hit the nail on the head or I answered an aspect that was not the main aspect that you actually were focused on in this question. But it seems to be uh, she's asking about Arjuna's, hesitancy for engaging in the battle against his own family. Well, generally, of course, everybody has affection for their family members, even if maybe they have some rifts among some of the family members. Certainly, no one would want to be put in a position where they would have to physically take up arms against members of their family. Although this did happen during the Civil War in America. And in other civil wars in other countries, sometimes this happens where members of the same family may find themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield. But generally, this doesn't happen. But Arjuna is just talking about the whole situation in general. I think that from a social human point of view, he's feeling the hesitancy to fight his family members. But there's no specific Vedic injunction that one should never uh, attack one's family. There's nothing like that. There's no specific injunction like that. In fact, the Vedas say that if someone was really equal poised, a king or an officer, he would not hesitate to reward an enemy's son if the enemy's son did something wonderful, nor would he hesitate to punish his own son if his own son did something culpable. So this is the way that people who administer justice should be. They should be blind to family connections if they're administering justice or administering the state. And I gave a stab at what I think the intent of the question is. Maybe Susan can fire back if I was in the same category of what she had anticipated as her question.
Susan, how about nod your head if Chandra Shekhara Swami satisfactorily answered your question? I think you did, Maharaj.
Okay, so
May,
sometimes
may,
hard.
I, may, I ask, may I ask a question, Yugalapriti?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's in general, it is felt that fear is much subsided since. If I'm talking about myself, since I become Krishna consciousness, the anxiety and fear is quite subsided, but periodically it comes back, and at some time it's very manifesting very strongly, and then we do the association and we do chanting and we do, and somehow, and we ask for mercy from the spiritual master. So a lot of things involved to come out of it. So though we do have this knowledge and we do have the experience, periodically, like we become, I become like totally like I never had one. And like there is a way, they call it reversal, right? Reverse. Like right now with the virus thing and my working in a hospital with all this going on, specifically at the beginning, when there were hundreds of people were intubated and all this. Now it seems to be better, but that involved me in all kind of issues. The fear, just one fear of that, made me like totally involved in all the material communications. It's like I was saying, it's a instead of sadhu sangha, maya sangha. So and how to deal with all that right now. For example, you're too busy even to get involved in other sangha, like working 12 hours a day and just chanting in between, and very difficult. So what's your advice?
Well, I think you're doing good. The nature of the material world is we've heard that there are three modes of nature: goodness, passion, ignorance, or sattva, rajas, and tamas. And the material world is like the weather. Sometimes one of the modes is more prominent, and sometimes another one is more prominent, and sometimes the third one is more prominent. So at different times, we may feel the push of the mode of goodness more, or we may feel the mode of ignorance more, or we might feel the mode of passion more. And that's why our determination, our realization kind of vacillate, because we're not fully insulated yet from the external modes. But as someone becomes more and more spiritually advanced, then they become more and more insulated from the external modes of nature that are active. So a person can be thrust into a mostly mode of ignorance surrounding or setting and not internalize or be affected by that internal setting. And that's the important part of actually maintaining a spiritual balance, that the spiritual um, practitioner, one who's serious about not only hearing the process, but actually implementing the process. Such a person becomes aloof from the modes, as we hear Mam Chayo Vyabhicharena Bhakti Yogena Sevate Sagunan Samatityatan Brahma Bhuyaya Kalpate, which is what it says in the Bhagavad-gita. I think that's 14th chapter. That one who engages in devotional service unfailing in all circumstances at once transcends the modes of material nature and thus comes to the level of Brahman. So as we're actually engaged in devotional service, we are being pulled out of the modes of nature. The problem is that we're not constantly engaged in the process of devotional service. We are sometimes engaged in devotional service and sometimes not. So we splash back and forth between the two worlds. And because we're splashing back and forth, sometimes we are covered over and sometimes we're not. Sometimes we have realization, sometimes we don't. And it is kind of bad to get thrust into a setting where one has to work enormous amount of time, and there's not so much time for spiritual reflection and for chanting or for reading or associating with devotees. That naturally will have its effect. And you know, the best thing is to always try to keep an equal balanced life where one is not completely eaten by their occupation. We don't have, no time left for anything other than our occupation. At the same time, through our daily sadhana, through our chanting, through our association of devotees, through our service, we will more and more find that it's like a submarine rising from the bottom of the ocean up to the top. The currents become less severe, and the difficulties become less intense, and our identification with the body becomes less intense. And we should expect that we're going to lose some, we're going to win some. We should expect that sometimes we will feel overwhelmed, and sometimes we won't feel so overwhelmed. So this is kind of the way things generally play out.
One more question.
Mhm.
What does it mean to be satisfied internally instead of external? Well, I understand externally it's Maya. Internally, does it mean you in your relationship with Krishna? Or
Yeah,
well, yeah, okay.
yeah, we are externally usually focused because most of us grow up and spend our whole lives imagining that happiness and satisfaction come from the external senses finding the right object. We find the right thing to hear, the right thing to see, the right thing to smell, the right thing to taste, and our lives, we feel, are on the right track. And of course, the world being what it is, most of the time we find that we don't find the right thing to smell, the right thing to taste, the right thing to see, the right thing to hear. We find things that are irritating instead to our senses. And for this reason, we feel dissatisfied or bored, or we feel lonely or lost, or we feel angry, or we feel frustrated. All these kind of symptoms come when the person identifies with the body, identifies with the senses, and identifies with the idea that the senses enjoying the sense objects are what is happiness. Um, when we discover that that's all a lie, even still, we know it's a lie. We still have to fight to connect ourselves internally with the spiritual world. And that's done through service. When we're engaged in service and we're fully thinking about serving the Supreme Lord, we find that these things go completely away. And we find also that we are happy and we're satisfied and we're fulfilled. And that's what we mean by being fulfilled internally. We are fulfilled in our service to Krishna. And eventually, as we discuss in the process of rising in the process of purification, one comes to the state where we actually meet Krishna face to face. And in that case, then we begin to become satisfied in our actual relationship with Krishna in an ongoing thing. But of course, that's a very, very high platform. And that's what the whole process of Krishna consciousness is intended to bring us to at some point or another.
Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you, Hare Krishna. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Atma, for this opportunity to speak to everyone. I hope that I got something across. I tried to use some of these, visual aids to make things a little bit easier, and well, I hope that helped too. I don't know how they came across, whether it was easy to see or not. And uh, you're going to do another kirtan, right? That's what you do at the end. Is that what happens next?
Yeah, Maharaj. Let's move to the next part of the program, which is the kirtan.